After Dracula fell, his curse lived on. Simon Belmont thought the nightmare was over, but in Castlevania II, Simon's quest, the true battle had only just begun. A journey not of strength, but of sorrow, silence, and shadow. This is the second. The skies over Transylvania hung low, a shroud of gloom cloaking the valley like a living spirit of the night. Amid the scorched ruins of Castle Dracula, Simon Belmont stood motionless, the vampire killer whip dripping with blood in his grip. The ash of Dracula's remains scattered in the wind, spiraling upward like a silent omen. He had won. The vampire lord, who had haunted generations with death and fear, was finally destroyed. Or so Simon thought. Returning from the battle, he was hailed as a hero. Villagers lined the streets, raising flags and singing praises of Simon the Great, the man who faced Dracula and did not flinch. But even in this moment of glory, Simon could find no peace. Something within him stirred, not guilt, not regret, but a cold, creeping unease that never left him. The wounds he had sustained in the final battle refused to heal. Aches haunted him at night, and then the dreams began. In those dreams, Dracula still lived, his body wreathed in a green, unnatural flame, eyes glowing like twin coals in the void. He never spoke, never screamed. He only smiled. And when Simon awoke, blood would trickle down his chest, seeping from old scars that should have long since closed. He sought healers, priests, even wandering mystics, but none could help. They would touch him, then recoil, whispering that something ancient, something unnatural, clung to him like a shadow. "There is a presence in you," one murmured, "that does not belong to the world of the living." Then, one stormy night, inside the remains of a crumbling chapel swallowed by the forest, he met the old man. Cloaked in gray, blind-eyed and skeletal, the man did not introduce himself. He simply stood, cane in hand, and spoke with a voice like wind rustling through the trees. "You did not simply kill him, you awakened him." Simon stepped back, hand tightening on his whip. Before he was cast into the ashes, Dracula bound you with a final curse, one older than your bloodline, a curse that festers not in the flesh, but in the soul. He cannot truly die, not while the 5 sacred relics of his body remain scattered across the land: his heart, his eye, his nail, his rib, and the cursed ring. So long as they exist, his hatred endures. And now it lives inside you. Simon's fury rose. "Then tell me how to end this." The old man handed him a scroll, aged parchment, inked with faded red symbols and a torn map. "Find them, bring the relics together, return to the castle, summon him once more, and this time Destroy him completely. Only then will the curse release you." Simon stood silent as thunder cracked the skies outside, rain pelting the chapel roof like tears of the forgotten. Finally, he nodded. At dawn, Simon left the village of Jova. He spoke no farewells. With him, he carried a leather pouch, a handful of coins, and the vampire killer, his fate-bound weapon. But Transylvania had changed. The roads were rotting. Trees had withered and twisted. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay. The light of day felt thinner now, as though the sun itself feared what dwelled beneath the soil. At each village he passed, doors slammed shut, eyes turned away. People whispered. They remembered. In the village of Veros, Simon encountered his first true sign of the curse's reach. Children cried at night for no reason. Lamps flickered without fuel. And every night at midnight, silence fell. Not the peace of sleep, but a hollow stillness, as though even time dared not move. An old woman, silver-haired and trembling, sold him a silver-tipped spear. She leaned in and whispered, "If you truly seek the demon's heart, go west to the swamp, but do not look into the water." Simon nodded his thanks, but his heart grew heavier. He now realized this quest would not only pit him against beasts and curses, but lies, forgotten truths, and a darkness that hid not in shadows, but in men's hearts. That night, sleep eluded him. It wasn't fear that kept him awake, but the sense that the world itself was changing around him. The moon seemed wrong, pale and cold, like a dead eye hanging in the sky. And far off in the woods, he heard laughter. Quiet, unnatural, not human. And then, just before dawn, the real darkness began. This was not mere nightfall. The world transformed. Creatures rose from the earth. Skeletons reassembled themselves and marched beneath twisted trees. Swarms of bloodthirsty bats circled above. Villagers vanished behind bolted doors. It was as if Dracula's death had torn open a wound in time. And Simon realized this curse wasn't his alone. Transylvania itself was bleeding. A cold wind swept across the land, reeking of blood, rot, and something older than life. Simon tightened his grip on the whip and stepped into the dark, where Dracula's heart awaited him. The morning after the first nightfall was drenched in fog. The sun, if it rose at all, cast no warmth. Simon stood alone at the edge of the village of Algiba, a place once known for its scholars and holy men. Now it felt abandoned even as people walked its narrow streets. No one made eye contact. Faces turned away. Doors closed without sound. The whispers he'd heard in Veros seemed louder here, spoken not with words, but with glances and silences. A town still breathing, but long since dead in spirit. He entered a tattered chapel, where the cross above the altar had been scorched black. A priest stood there, old and thin, his face gaunt and sleepless. He didn't greet Simon. Instead, he said only one thing. "The night takes more from us each time it comes." Simon nodded, not asking how the priest knew who he was. At this point, it didn't matter. He moved through the town, gathering fragments of conversation, some useful, most cryptic. "Kneel by the lake," one man mumbled. "The ferryman will come, if he chooses." Another whispered, "Garlic drives away what the whip cannot." Others laughed, said nothing, or lied outright. In Algiba, truth was as thin as the light. The townspeople spoke of 5 mansions, ancient places scattered across Transylvania, where Dracula's remains were hidden. Each one a fortress built in forgotten times, guarded by traps, spirits, and worse. But no one seemed to know exactly where they were. The maps were gone, the memories faded, or perhaps buried on purpose. What Simon did know was this: to survive, he would need tools. Holy water to reveal hidden paths, sacred laurels to walk through poison swamps, wooden stakes to pierce the cursed hearts that protected Dracula's relics. And he would have to buy them, not with gold, but with trust, risk, and sometimes with blood. He left Algiba before dusk, guided only by rumors and half-truths. The path led him through the forest of Dabi, a place where even the birds dared not sing. Trees stood like black spears, their branches curled like claws. And when night fell again, it came like a hammer. The change was immediate. The wind died, the stars vanished. Quakes shook the forest floor, and then howls. The dead returned. Simon's whip cracked through the night. Skeletons clattered from the earth. Ghastly wolves with red eyes stalked the treetops, leaping from shadow to shadow. He moved forward relentlessly, remembering what the priest had said: "The night always takes more." By dawn, Simon emerged onto a plain where a ruined village sat beneath a cliff. The villagers here had long stopped hiding. They simply watched him from windows, pale and tired. A woman stepped forward and offered him a sprig of garlic without speaking. He nodded in thanks and tucked it into his satchel. He descended into the caves beneath the cliffs. The smell of rot was stronger here, moist, ancient. He lit a torch. Walls glistened with slime, and the echoes of his footsteps followed him like ghosts. It was in those caves that he found the first true entrance, Berkeley Mansion.
A crumbled stone gate, flanked by headless statues, led into the ruins. Inside, it was dark beyond torchlight, the kind of dark that swallowed fire. Simon stepped forward, whip at the ready, and began the descent. The mansion was no mere building. It was a labyrinth built to confuse and torment. Floors crumbled beneath his feet. Illusions cloaked real walls. Spirits drifted just beyond reach, whispering in dead languages. And always, always there was the sense of being watched. He fought his way through creatures born of nightmare. Blood-gargling knights, phantom sorcerers, flailing corpses chained to the walls. But none of them frightened Simon more than the silence. There were no cries of pain, no breathing, only his own heartbeat and the soft creak of wood under his boots. In the center of the mansion, he found it, a black altar carved with glyphs older than the Belmont name. Floating above it, pulsing faintly, was Dracula's rib, encased in a shimmering hex. He reached for it, and from the shadows behind the altar, a thing emerged. It had once been human, that much Simon could sense. But now its skin was gray and flaking, its eyes two pits of hunger. It wore remnants of armor, and in its clawed hand was a curved sword that glowed red. A guardian, a cursed knight bound for eternity to protect a dead man's bones. The battle was swift, brutal. The whip clashed against metal. Simon ducked, struck, rolled. The knight moved with inhuman speed, as though every cut it took only made it faster. But Simon had learned. He drove the whip into its skull with a prayer, and the creature collapsed into dust. The hex vanished. The rib dropped. Simon held it in his hands and felt the air shift. A pulse of cold went through the room, as if the mansion itself exhaled. One piece claimed, 4 remain. He left the mansion at dusk. The forest had grown quiet, too quiet. No wind, no birds, as if the very world knew what he carried. He returned to a nearby town, just long enough to rest, replenish supplies, and ask more questions. They answered the way all villagers did, in riddles. "You'll need a flame to cross the swamp," one said. "Don't forget the silk bag," another insisted, though never said why. "Ask the ferryman, but only once." It was like piecing together a dream told by a madman. But Simon understood now. This quest would not follow reason. Dracula's influence twisted not only flesh and land, but also memory, truth, and time. He began to suspect that some of the villagers were not fully alive. Their eyes were too still, their movements too practiced. When he left, none of them said goodbye. By now, the cycle of day and night had become more than routine. It was a rhythm, a breath. The day gave him clues, the night gave him scars. Both necessary. With Dracula's rib in his pack and the map fragment now updated with shaky symbols, Simon pushed forward, deeper into cursed lands. The second mansion lay somewhere beyond the poisonous swamp, where the air choked with green fog and the ground burned your boots. There, another piece of the count awaited. But so did the creatures who remembered him, who hated him, and who would do anything to ensure Dracula's return. Simon knew what lay ahead, yet he did not hesitate, because something far worse than monsters stalked him now. Time.
The second mansion lay beyond a land twisted by sickness. The path to it was barely a road anymore, just mud and moss and bones swallowed by the swamp. The trees here drooped like they were dying mid-scream, their branches tangled in shapes no human hand had drawn. Simon wrapped a damp cloth over his mouth as he stepped into the murk, each breath filled with rot and spores. The cursed land was alive, and it wanted him to turn back. But Simon pressed forward. He used sacred laurels to shield his skin from the poison mist. The villagers had spoken in riddles, but their warnings proved true.
Without the leaves of the blessed tree, the swamp would eat flesh like acid. He moved carefully, timing his breaths, eyes sharp for signs of the mansion. Then he saw it, Brahm's mansion. It rose from the swamp like a half-sunken memory, its walls bloated with mold and broken columns jutting out like ribs. The gates stood open. Simon entered. This mansion was colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. He felt watched not by a monster, but by the mansion itself. Traps were more deceptive here, illusions thicker. Shadows whispered his name. Deep within, after solving puzzles that seemed designed by madness itself, he reached the relic, Dracula's heart. It pulsed with a faint glow, black-red, like coal smoldering in its final breath. A guardian arose again, this time a beast of flame and smoke. It hissed in a voice that sounded like burning paper. The battle was relentless, and Simon barely stood when he struck the final blow. The heart, once claimed, gave him a vision. He saw a castle not in ruin, but reborn, filled with candles and laughter, not Dracula's laugh, but his own. The vision passed. Simon staggered out of the mansion. He had 2 pieces now, and the journey had only grown darker. The third relic waited beyond a forest where time felt broken. Days passed in minutes, nights stretched for eternity. He moved like a ghost between villages. One town greeted him as a savior. The next accused him of being the curse itself. He stopped correcting them. Perhaps both were true. In a chapel with no roof, a blind girl told him to kneel beneath the dead tree when the moon was full. He did. A portal opened, and the path to Bodley Mansion revealed itself, hidden between seconds of reality. Inside, he found the Eye. This one was different. The relic did not resist. It floated to him, almost eager. When he touched it, his own vision sharpened. He could see false walls, invisible stairs, illusions shattered in his gaze. But it came with a cost. He now saw the faces of the dead, in windows, in mirrors, in puddles of water. They whispered not warnings, but regrets. They looked like people he might have saved if he'd been faster, stronger, wiser. The Eye had opened something he couldn't shut. Still, he pressed on. The fourth mansion was the most broken. Laruba Mansion had burned once, and it still smelled of smoke. Simon passed through walls that wept blood. Floors fell into nothing. The relic here, Dracula's nail, was embedded in the spine of a corpse too large to be human. Removing it awoke the husk. The fight was no longer physical. The creature barely moved, but its presence filled the room. Simon's memories turned against him, flashes of guilt, loss, fear. He screamed not from wounds, but from truths he had buried. He won, barely. When he emerged, his hands were shaking, not from battle, from doubt. 4 pieces. He returned to a lakeside town where children no longer played and dogs no longer barked. A man with no tongue handed him a silver dagger and pointed toward the river. The ferryman was waiting. Simon stepped onto the boat. Mist rose, thicker than breath, and the ferryman rowed in silence. The river bent in impossible directions, time unspooled. When the boat stopped, Simon was not sure how many hours had passed, or days. They had reached the final mansion, Castlevania itself, or rather, its shadow, a warped version of the original, buried beneath the earth. This was where the ring was hidden. The cursed ring. Unlike the other relics, this one did not rest. It spun in the air, surrounded by runes. Simon entered the circle, and it seared a mark onto his palm. He screamed, and for a moment, Dracula's voice echoed in his head. "So close, Belmont. You carry me already." Simon collapsed. The ring fell into his pack. 5 pieces. He awoke on the banks of the river, unsure how he'd left. The boat was gone. Night had fallen, and the ritual waited. Cold, haunting, ritualistic. Simon returned to the ruins of the original Castle Dracula. No longer just a monument to evil, the castle had become a place of convergence. Thunder rolled overhead. The wind carried whispers, fragments of language long forgotten. The castle gates, once shattered, stood tall again, rebuilt not by man, but by magic. He stepped inside. The interior was both familiar and wrong. Corridors had shifted. Portraits he remembered burning were whole again. The bloodstains on the stone floor, they were fresh. In the main hall, the altar awaited. Simon removed the relics from his pack one by one. The rib, the heart, the eye, the nail, the ring. He placed each into the slots on the obsidian slab. The runes ignited, casting crimson light against the walls. The castle shook. A wind without source howled through the chamber. The relics rose into the air, spinning faster and faster, until they became a single blur. A void opened above them, and from it, Dracula began to return. First as smoke, then form, bone, flesh, cloak, the crown of the night, eyes that remembered too much. He stood tall, regal, unbroken by death. The same smile from Simon's nightmares spread across his face. "You came back, Belmont. How poetic." Simon said nothing. He had no words left, only resolve. He cracked the vampire killer. Dracula laughed. The final battle began. Their clash shook the very bones of the castle. Lightning ripped through the stained glass windows, illuminating stone walls that bled shadow. Simon's whip lashed with centuries of legacy. Dracula answered with darkness incarnate, blades of blood, fire drawn from the void, illusions crafted from Simon's deepest memories. It was not just strength that Dracula wielded. It was Simon's own fear. At one point, the Count took the form of Simon's father. At another, his younger self. He whispered words Simon had buried, regrets, failures, names of the dead. But Simon endured. Blow after blow, cut after cut. He bled from a dozen wounds, but never dropped the whip. He knew this was not just a fight for survival. It was a reckoning. Then came the final strike. A crack of the vampire killer, a roar, a flash of red. Dracula screamed,
not in rage, but in relief. His body crumbled into ash. His eyes, just before they vanished, held not malice, but something else. Release or a promise? The relics turned to dust. The castle groaned, the walls fractured. Simon fled through collapsing halls, vaulting over debris, until he burst into the cold night air. He stood alone on the cliff where his journey had begun. The castle behind him fell inward, vanishing into mist. It was over, or so he told himself. He looked at his palm. The scar from the ring still glowed faintly. The villagers would never know the full truth. History would remember him as the man who vanquished Dracula a second time, perhaps the final time. But deep down, Simon knew. Evil does not die. It waits. And somewhere, in shadow, Dracula waits too. Simon survived, but he was never truly free. The curse may have ended for now, but evil like Dracula's doesn't die. It sleeps, it waits, and when the night returns, so will the darkness. Thank you for walking with us through this shadowed tale. If it stirred something within you, you're not alone. Until next time, choose courage, choose light, even when all the world turns dark.